Hello and welcome to Fire in the Valley. Today we have myself, Mighty Pete, and we're joined by Elliot Connor. Good afternoon, or good evening, as I should say for you, Elliot.
Hi there.
Thanks very much for coming on. So, Elliot, tell us, who are you, what are you doing, where are you from?
Sure, I'm a 17-year-old storyteller, community builder, charity CEO, conservationist, a mix of those, working broadly speaking in this environmental space. So very much looking to try and give other people the opportunity to connect back with nature. So building that family tree of life back up, integrating humans into these ecosystems where we've come from, in a sense. So, yeah, I really love what I do. I managed to do it through all sorts of different paths. I did a TEDx talk earlier this year. I mentioned I just wrote my first book, which is very exciting. I started a podcast. I do animal rescuing and rehab here in Sydney as well. So that's something I really enjoy. But yeah, really trying to make the world a better place for people and for animals.
Well, okay. Family tree of life. Explain that to us, please.
Sure. So, I mean, it may seem fairly obvious to some, but as humans have moved into cities, as we've urbanized, changed ourselves almost as a species, we've developed a sort of disconnect to nature, so we don't see it as much in our daily lives. We certainly don't appreciate it as much. So it's very much about trying to give people the knowledge, the skills to see that nature still is all around them and they can contribute to it, give back, help it regenerate, live ultimately in harmony with other animals in or whichever way they see fit. So I think it's really important that we make that change now as we return to this new normal, as we really look hard at ourselves and how we live out our lives. But that's essentially where we're aiming towards.
Oh, well, yes, there's a lot. I can tell we're going to go deep here, so this is good. Well, I am just going to go straight in here. What, I mean, humans and nature, I mean, do you see it as one and the same, or have we drifted away from nature as we might know it?
I mean, I'd love to see it as one of the same. I think that's how we should see it. That's not, unfortunately, how most people see it. And especially with the nature part as well. We're moving towards a very purist sense of what nature is. We're seeing it as these pristine, untouched, let's say the Amazon rainforest or the Great Barrier Reef. Some half decent examples like that, even though they are under threat, even though they're being damaged by various human processes. These are the nature we've come to learn, come to accept in our geography classes at school or outside in the popular media. Whereas nature really is anything living. So I've got a lovely example of nature in my garden. I've got a very wild garden out back, and I mentioned I do the animal rescuing. So a small menagerie out there. That's all nature, as is the pigeons I pass in the bus and the way to school, as is all the urban wildlife I certainly get to see here in Sydney, which is a beautiful green city, but in every other city and every other urban place around the globe. So that's a really important distinction to make in terms of what nature is. In terms of what humans are, I think very much part of nature, much as we might like to argue against that, try and say why we're unique, special as these Homo sapiens, these human animals. I think it's really important to perhaps take a step back from our inflated ego, try and see that all of our traits are possessed by other animals. There really is no single factor which makes humans unique. There's a quote I love, and I'll finish my slightly extended answer on this, but I think Charles Darwin once said that the difference between man and animal is one of degree and not of kind. So saying that animals are very much like humans, but humans just have more of some qualities, less of others, which makes us who we are.
Okay, so then as a human, what is our positive attributes then? And contributions to nature, I would possibly add to
that. Yeah, so in this book I've just been writing, just called Human Nature, so this is the philosophy I teach, it's a worldview of mine. I make the argument that humans can be defined as opportunistic ecosystem engineers. So this combination of two major traits, we're opportunists, which means like, say, rats, brown rat has followed humans everywhere we traveled across the globe. It can be found everywhere humans are, except for Alaska. And that's only because they've set up a big border fence, a huge border security patrol 24/7 to stop them coming in. So brown rats, excellent example of opportunists. They're able to live in all sorts of environments, human environments and otherwise. They're able to make the most of these modified ecosystems, if you want to look at them that way. But then we're also these ecosystem engineers, so meaning that we change our environments around us as well as being able to live effectively in new ones. So an example of that would be, say, a beaver. When a beaver builds a dam, it rediverts, changes the flow of a river, the famous example being Yellowstone National Park. When they removed the wolves from that ecosystem, they were hunted mostly or culled deliberately until they were extinct locally, and that caused all of the populations of the smaller animals, especially the prey items, to change, beavers included. When that changed, then the river flow changed, which is this famous example used across all sorts of environmental rhetoric about these flows within nature. They're called trophic cascades. So when you have more beavers, then the rivers are diverted more. So you get very unstable banks. It means that you've got different habitat niches for all sorts of different animals. It means that you have, a really, really different ecosystem in many different respects. So that's what humans have been doing on a much wider scale. So those would be the two traits by which I define humans. Whether they're positive or negative depends on how we use them.
No, it is interesting because whenever you choose, and I think choice is probably the optimal word there, but you choose to get involved, the knock-on consequences can be, as you said, the wolves versus the beavers. It's, who would have thought? It's a bit of an intangible link, but so it's curious. Just before we get into it, I mean, really, what would you say is what's fire in the belly mean to you?
I mean, for me, I'm doing the work I do as a miner. So I started this human nature projects when I was 16 years old, and that was really difficult for me. So especially those first few months, I was working extremely long hours, getting very little sleep, trying to build up this community, and also work through various legal complications because the system's not set up as a miner to start a major international environmental NGO. It just doesn't work like that. So yeah, I had a few early hitches which I had to work through, which I had to find the perseverance, the self-belief, this confidence to be able to work through and to gain advice for, to reach out to others for that. So for me, the fire in the belly is being true to yourself, having this authenticity as a leader, and just having that self-assurance that you can work through even some of these nitty-gritty problems you come across in sort of work I do. Whatever does arise, that you can work through it both individually and finding your tribe to support you. So finding those fellow leaders who appreciate your mission, who can be part of this journey too. And that all contributes to this fire in your belly, this motivation, this drive, keeping you going.
And you mentioned there the word self-belief. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a born introvert. I definitely don't take naturally to public speaking, to opening up about myself, my vision. All of this is a very strange, almost surreal experience for me. That self-belief for me was all about trying to really look deep internally, see who I was, what I was fighting for. I even learned that myself in some cases. Being true to myself, but then sharing that with others is a certain vulnerability I think you need as a leader. So being able to really, really open up as much as you can to others, be they in your team or otherwise. Being able to recognize who you are, but then being able to share that brutally in some cases, very honestly, frankly, and working with others to enhance yourself personally and professionally. It takes a lot of guts, a lot of confidence, certainly for people like myself to do that. So it was a big initial step, a steep learning curve, but it was that self-belief, I think, which catalyzed it, which allowed that process.
I'm curious in your body language there. I mean, you mentioned there guts, confidence, brutality, and all strike a very. I don't know whether it was sort of a nervous tension slash glee. It was a mixture on your face that you seem to treasure that, and I'm just curious. I mean, any insights on that?
Oh, yeah, it's a difficult question. I think I definitely do find it difficult talking about myself, but I'm also someone who revels in sort of challenge, a sense of I don't know what's coming next. So I do have this nervous enjoyment with many of the things I encounter in my work. So perhaps that's what's coming through. But I'm not too bad on sort of one-to-one interviews and Zooms and the like. It's larger. So that TED talk was a huge milestone for me, being able to speak to an audience that size. It's these larger conferences which I really struggle with. So having all that expectation, that weight on your shoulders, something I deal with to some degree on a daily basis. So running this charity of mine, but then having that come to a head, that I think is where you're really biting the nail.
Talk to us about the TED journey then.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of very few early speaking engagements I had. It was probably maybe a second, third major speech I did to any size audience, including online webinars, things like that. So it was a huge step up for me, but I was invited, thankfully, to speak at this event. It was the TEDx SB Giant here in Sydney. So the theme for the conference was permanent beta. So about how we as humans need to constantly adapt, to change our ways, to better suit the needs of whatever we're doing, our work or our personal lives. And that fitted in with some of the blogs I've been writing, with some of my messaging of late around that time about what we can learn from evolution. So this was a topic of my speech. It was evolution and how to save the world. So I looked at 5 laws of evolution in the Darwinian sense, and tried to apply them to how we can better ourselves as humans, how we can be these better animals, but also how we can develop as our societies, as a culture, to live peacefully and sustainably alongside nature. So I found that really, really interesting, researching that, and it, I guess, formed the seed of an idea for this book. I then went on to write during the lockdown here in Sydney for many of the other works I've done since. It's all this journey for me. So one thing leads to another, but getting those thoughts down in a 15-minute speech was really quite transformational. I think it's definitely a process and exercise I'd recommend to anyone, regardless of whether you do end up presenting it, or whether it's just how you get your thoughts down on paper. Having to put everything down in that short space of time to make it engaging, accessible to a wider audience is really a challenge. Certainly for the likes of myself, not taking naturally to that stage. But it was a very, very valuable experience, as I say, and incredible support along the way.
What was your takeaways from that?
Yeah, a few things. I mean, it definitely gave me a boost in that self-confidence. It allowed me to see that I could do this sort of thing. It certainly helped my technique with some of the advice I was given. They do a proper job, TED, training you up beforehand, giving you that coaching almost to be able to deliver this speech confidently, successfully. In terms of the ideas themselves, what it really drove home to me is some of the effective ways of getting people interested in conservation in this environmental field. So ever since, I've been very much trying to incorporate, it's called conservation optimism. So very much looking on the bright side of how things are going, which can be hard at times, but looking, say, at where we've achieved some of the successes in conservation, looking at how far we've come in the past 60, 70 years, being a relatively recent movement we're working in, and what that might teach us about where we can be by 2050 or 2100, instead of how much worse off the world is going to be by those dates, as we frequently hear. So I think that was something it showed me was really important. But the other thing it showed, interestingly, was some of that knowledge gap as well. So I'd sensed it in some of the work I was doing, but never quite put my finger on it in terms of how patchy in many places our knowledge collectively as a society, or certainly with my audience who I spoke to afterwards there, how patchy their knowledge was of these environmental issues and of nature itself. Really basic natural history. So shortly after that event, I did a survey of about 1,000 people from sort of all walks of life about what they knew. It was, I think it was 8 multiple choice questions, out of which they got less than random chance. So there were 3 options for each, and they got 2 out of the 8 correct. So they would have done better guessing, which I found incredible, because it means we have these systematic biases even in the way we look at nature. We know less than nothing. So that really opened my eyes as well, and it set me down this path in terms of making nature accessible, working in environmental education.
I'm curious in your language as well. It sort of slightly changes, but would you say you're pain driven or pleasure driven? Where do you sit?
Oh, yeah. Uh, I enjoy the successes. So I've always had a method in which I do like a fist pump whenever I get a piece of good news, a comforting email, something which has come through, a project which has been successful. That fist pump allows me to recognize it in a physical manner, so it doesn't just pass over the head. And that definitely helps me in my work. But I'm also quite perfectionist, I guess is the word, but not even that. I'm quite vision driven. So I've got these ideals which I'm working towards. And if something does fall short, so if there are these pains in the process, these obstacles which I have to overcome, then that does frustrate me, keep me going, keep those long nights working. But it's a mixture. I think primarily the latter in many cases.
Talk to me about your ideals.
Yeah, so I mean, I express it as this human nature worldview, being most of what we talked about. So being able to treat animals with respect, appreciation, compassion, showing them this dignity, this right to live, a right to thrive alongside ourselves as humanity. I think that embodies itself in many different forms across the work I do and across society at large, as we're trying to change perspectives primarily in terms of how people look at nature, how people interact with animals in their daily lives. Is quite a major undertaking. But for me, the ideal is if we can all have that connection to nature. I've been incredibly lucky over my few years working in this space to have some amazing opportunities. So getting out in nature, seeing animals at their best, doing rescue work here in Sydney, I get to see them recover. So some of their incredible resilience as well. But that's quite a unique situation, obviously. So I'd love to make that much more accessible, democratize it, if you will, to a wider consumption. I think if you can do that, if you can give people the chance to appreciate nature on its own terms, that would be incredibly powerful. So my ideal would be a world in which we humans recognize ourselves as animals, which we work with nature, not against it, to improve the state of our planet and to improve our own lives, because there's a tremendous amount we can learn from nature and from other animals as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we probably only understand a fraction of what's out there. I mean, in terms then of humans and the sort of the food chain or the animal hierarchy as such, where are we?
Oh, where are we indeed? Yeah, it's a difficult question, isn't it? Because the stereotype would be humans being way up at the top of the food chain. It's true largely. We do have a superior technology, you may argue, to many animals. We've advanced to a stage in which we can cause large, widespread damage to other living creatures, if we so choose, to their natural habitats. But then again, you have the fact that all of nature is this complex web. So even this food chain concept is incredibly misleading. It's a web. All animals have some rough place on the hierarchy, but say you may have an animal which eats another animal, but which is itself eaten by an animal which is eaten by the first animal. So it's all this circle of life. Everything goes round and round and round. We're built up from nutrients which probably once belonged to a caterpillar. It's like, where does it stop? Where does it end? Where do you take your measurement from? It's a very hard question to answer. In that respect, humans are incredibly advanced. We've done amazingly for great ape species, but I don't like to put us on the top of a food chain on XYZ spot on a web. I think nature's much too flexible for categorization like that. So I'd much rather we saw some of the flows, some of these linkages which we're part of instead.
That's interesting. So you don't so much see it in a hierarchical point of view, but it's more like a, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but it's almost like a spider diagram flowing organism in itself, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. There's a Doctor Who quote, I think, about time being full of this mess of timey-wimey stuff. So nature's full of this naturey stuff. You don't need to categorize it. It's all there. It's all mixed up, bundled together, as opposed to some of the stricter classifications. So that would be what the Greeks said. We had Aristotle's scala naturae, this ladder, this great rung of being. So with devils, with rocks at the bottom, with humans, then God, just higher, right at the top. So yeah, I think that's an old way of thinking about life and about our place as humans. We need to recognize some of the more recent research and some of our newer models about how nature works and where we fit into it.
Out of curiosity, where does God come into this for you?
Yeah, I've never been a religious person, so I don't subscribe to any set of religious beliefs, but I certainly appreciate those who do, and religious people form a very solid core group in conservation, so frequently working with religious groups of all sorts, I think it's incredibly interesting, the environmental field I work in, just because of the diversity of people there. So whilst I may not subscribe to those beliefs, I certainly appreciate the power of those who do. And many religions do a much better job than the lack thereof in terms of teaching people about protecting nature. There's some wonderful examples of faith being used for good in that respect. So yeah, I haven't been converted yet, but I keep an open mind.
It's interesting. I mean, it's like I say, that's the beauty of humans. We have choice, you know, and we choose what to do. So take us right back, Elliot. You know, give us an idea. Where are you from originally? Talk to us about your background and, you know, what you were like as a young fella.
Yeah, well, I think in many respects I'm still a young fella, but I come from the British background. You can probably tell somewhat from the accent. I came from south of Britain, sort of Leicestershire area, thereabouts. And I spent the first 4 or 5 years of my life over there. I think it's still part of who I am, part of my culture. I obviously grew up with a British family where bird watching, long walks in the countryside. It's all part of who I am and who I was, which certainly shaped me growing up. We took family holidays to see nature, being a family of amateur bird watchers, picked some of that up. Actually, my first volunteering placement in this sort of field was with a group called BirdLife Australia, so the largest bird watching, bird conservation organisation over here. And I was just taking members of the public, often families, around a small museum, like a discovery centre they had just in a local park. So I really enjoyed that and built off much of my own personal experience, learning about Australia's avian life, which is much better than the British equivalent. So I love it over here. It's a beautiful country.
Why do you say better?
Sorry?
Why do you say better? The avian life being better?
It's a controversial point. I don't doubt that. And the bird watching community in Britain is much larger, ironically. But Australia has approximately twice as many bird species, depending on what list you subscribe to, depending on how you count it. But they're also much more interesting, I find, personal opinion. You can't be objective about this, but really, really fascinating birds we get over here. We've got many of the social birds, so quite rare that they work together, live together in these family groups. The apostle birds, the choughs, some of these ones you may see on an Attenborough documentary, and the likes of that. So we have the colourful, charismatic parrots. So I've got a lorikeet called Juliet in care at the moment. Slightly vicious creature, but lovely all the same. So, I mean, they're incredible, intelligent creatures as well. So that's something I really enjoy. But on the whole, it's a very vibrant bird life we get over here, which makes up for the mammals as well, because about 70-80% of Aussie mammals are nocturnal. So we don't see those. We do see the birds, which it's a very different balance to what you might get abroad.
You ever tempted to go nocturnal yourself to be able to follow the nature?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy the occasional spotlighting trip. The challenge with Australian nightlife and with seeing many of those mammals is they're shy, they're very furtive creatures. On the whole, we get possums on the roof. So some of them are human habituated pests for many, but yeah, it's really interesting, some of what comes out at night. Really difficult to see as well, especially in urban landscape. Here in Sydney, it doesn't do so well as birds, which do quite well, or many of them do, in terms of the human settlement. Aggressive parrots, very good at fighting for their territory, fighting for chips on the beach or whatever they're after. They do very well out of human settlement.
You used a word there unusually as pest. What is a pest?
Oh, yeah. Well, possums here are considered pests because they often lodge in people's roofs. So they create loud bangs noises in the night. They may make it inside, steal food, generally make a nuisance of themselves, which leads to this characterization. I don't subscribe to that. I think possums are incredible animals, but it's really interesting, the dynamic Australians have with nature, being this wonderful, rich, diverse country. Having spoken to both sides of the scale, so I work with some really passionate people, but also see those who perhaps aren't so keen on any form of living creature at all. It's interesting because Australians are blessed with a wonderful diversity of nature, but many of them don't have the slightest clue what's out there, what this bird's called, that bird's called, what a possum is, even instead of a rat-like creature the size of a dog with a long tail on my roof. So yeah, it's interesting working where I am, based here in Sydney. But possums do get a pretty bad rap alongside a few other critters.
What's your take on it then? Have you equal time for them, or do you have a preference?
Oh, well, I've cared for them over the years, so built some really strong relationships with animals, as you do, giving them medications, feeding them, changing their cages, cleaning them out, holding them, examining them over the course of many weeks. It's got very few comparisons you can draw. It's unlike any human relationship. It's quite close, quite intimate in terms of that bond you form with these other living creatures, be they birds, I often care for, or the occasional possum. So once you've had that experience, you can't see the other side of the story. It's very, very transformational in that respect. It's what I was talking about earlier, connecting with nature, giving people those opportunities. If they can see what animals are, can be, then that changes everything.
Interesting. I mean, you take Darwin and the hierarchy and things like that. I mean, are you affecting the hierarchy by caring for the animals and harm has been caused or some reason they need to come into care? Is it not survival of the fittest?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. And it does occur to me on certain rescues, especially on the whole, it's mostly human impacts which we're mitigating. So I get a lot of frogmouths in, sort of owl-type birds, and they are often hit by cars. So they get a concussion, from these vehicle collisions, which, I mean, I don't think it's be fair to call that survival of the fittest, calling those which can't avoid cars stupid or unfit. It's not a natural process. Likewise, say with possums, often attacked by feral cats or people's domestic cats, which are inadequately housed, cared for. So they get out, they cause all manner of damage. So yeah, it's a good question, and it definitely comes up. Juliet, I mentioned the log kit we've got in care. That was most likely just a squabble with another bird. In terms of moral high ground, if it's right to care for that, who knows? But you're doing the best you can for the animals. I think that's the same we do with humans. So why have lower standards for other animals? Indeed. The one case which does come to mind where I think it was much harder to make the call was we had a diamond python, so a snake, which was just in the trees outside someone's house, and they had a possum nest. So possums sleep in these sort of wooden hives, if you will, in trees, these shelter constructions which they build. And the python had found one. There was a mother possum with 2 young, but had become separated from one. So do you intervene? It's a perilous situation. Either way you take. There's been some really interesting controversies in wildlife film where I'm headed towards in terms of what do you do? So you see this young animal often in dire need. You can intervene, you can save it, or you can leave it to die. But I think the moral thing from my perspective is to give it that chance. It's a difficult question, but that would be my answer.
It is interesting. I mean, have you an overarching mantra, or something that you sort of aspire to as a common spine or source, if you like?
Yeah, well, I think assessing these situations, what I'm trying to do is imagine those animals were people. Say, what would we do if, say, it were people in that situation, if they've been hit by a car, had a vehicle collision, would you care for them? Would you leave them on the road? I think it's an obvious answer. So in that case, you would definitely care for it in terms of whether you leave a human to be preyed upon by a giant snake or by a lion on the loose. Yeah, that's how I'd answer the question. I think that's how we need to look at things increasingly, giving animals almost an equal standing in terms of how we view them alongside ourselves as humans. It's a major change, to be sure, and it's one we'll never be able to fully embody. But if we can start looking at things that way, I think it will change quite a lot.
That's interesting, because you're using nature as the benchmark, and yet when it comes to the compassion side, you're using humanity as the benchmark.
Well, I mean, they're one and the same, aren't they?
I don't know. You tell me.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's all these thought tools you can use to try and see it. It's human nature worldview. Can we, as humans, live happily and considerately alongside other animals? This is how I found it's easiest to do so. So that's what I found works for me. But as I say, it's a very new field of thought, especially this sort of rights of nature. So looking at animals as living entities, sentient, conscious beings with rights, with emotions, which need to be cared for. I think we'll find in the next few decades, in the next 24 years, then we'll see much of this thought process changes quite dramatically in terms of how we look at nature and how we look at ourselves. It's anyone's guess where we're headed towards. But I'd love to see some of this human nature worldview embodied in that.
So in terms then,
give me a sec, my headphone.
So yeah, I mean, it's amazing the different views on it. So I'm curious then, from you were saying you had sort of helped out, or you were working here in the local museum, you said, I think it was, you're talking about animals, and you were giving talks.
Discovery Centre.
Yeah, Discovery Centre. So was that one of your first jobs, or?
I was a voluntary position. I was doing my Duke of Edinburgh award at the time.
Mhm.
So it's just a community service placement, giving back in that way. And I knew I had this passion for nature, had some skills in bird watching. So it was an ideal placement for me, being able to share that with others. And it opened many doors to further placements in this field, especially locally. So building that contact, which was really beneficial for me.
In terms of a particular animal species sector, are you drawn to natural or a certain area of nature?
Yeah, it's a question I'm asked occasionally, and I find it really difficult to answer. I mean, initially, when I started getting into this space more vigorously, more systematically, I spent about 6 months photographing insects, spiders, some of the mini beasts in my garden, back I mentioned. It's quite wild, quite bushy, plenty of insect fauna for me to look around at. I was taking photos of them with an old macro lens, so close-ups, and posting them on a website called iNaturalist, which does sort of crowdsourced identifications for these critters. So it was a really effective way actually for me to learn more about these animals, and obviously insects, incredibly complex, all sorts of species, varieties out there, which you have to master. So that was really interesting for me. And I still feel that connection to smaller insects and other critters I faced. Assassin bugs, fig tree leaf beetles, stick insects, all sorts of critters just on my desk here and in my room. So I definitely love them. I love the birds as well. I mean, bird watching is great because we are able to attribute many human characteristics, personalities to these creatures. They're very enigmatic birds often. They're very vibrant, fascinating to watch indeed. So I love the birds, but it's really hard to choose. So even my favorite animal would change on a weekly basis. If you ask me, I think I love all of nature. Often my favorite animals are those I have in care at the moment, because those are the ones I feel very close to. I recently released a baby brush turkey, so a local bird, but that was one of my favorites of all time. Its name was Ned, and I built a really good rapport with it. It loved blueberries. So very, very cute seeing it rush up from the cage when I approached, giving it its feed, medications, had an eye infection, which needed curing. So yeah, no, it's tough letting them go, but I developed really strong relationships with those animals as well. They're often my favourites at the time, if you want to call them that.
Interesting, you name them as well.
Yes, yeah. Actually, we've got a naming system for most types of animals. So the lorikeets are the most common, and they're named after Shakespeare characters. So plenty to choose from there. We've had a few. We've had Hamlet and Othello, Romeo, Juliet, etc. Frogmouths, I mentioned. So these owl-type birds, they take the guise of classical composers. So we've had Bach, Handel, Mozart, and such. The brush turkey was a new one, so that became a bushranger theme, hence the Ned, as in Ned Kelly. But I don't imagine getting many more, so that's a smaller set to choose from. But I think it's great giving them names. That was famously a methodology pioneered by Jane Goodall in Gombe, really inspirational figure herself. So going against scientific consensus, giving the chimps she studied names in her research, seen as very, very strange, frowned upon at the time. But these are people-like creatures. They've definitely got personalities. They're individuals. So why not name them?
Interesting again, and inspirational people. I mean, who stands out for you overall of heroes, inspirational people, aspirational people?
Many people, I think, have been incredibly lucky as this younger generation of environmentalists to have these great figureheads to look up to. So the likes of Attenborough, starting effectively pioneering this wildlife film documentary production space, bringing that to audiences, millions of people all across the globe. I think that's incredibly inspirational. A path to follow if I can fill some of those footsteps. I mentioned Good already, so some of the work she did in changing the way we view animals. Famously, she worked against the predominant viewpoint of man the toolmaker. So Man is unique in that we're the only animal who's able to build tools to use to our purposes. So she showed that chimps are able to do likewise. We've since found that they actually hunt with spears as well, in some cases. Get animals building some quite complex tools. So that was really interesting pioneering work that she did as well. Some others, Lawrence Anthony, lesser known. He was a South African conservationist, but really powerful story. So he owned a game reserve in South Africa called Tula Tula, and he was called up one day actually. So there was a herd of rogue elephants on the other side of the country. Their matriarch had been shot actually, so the leading female in the herd, and being very close knit family groups, societies that elephants live in, the others had gone rampant and threatened to be all shot down as culled within days. But he took them onto his property. Incredibly dangerous act. A herd of rogue elephants can completely flatten a game reserve. They did. They escaped multiple times into the surrounding countryside. They broke through the fences, electric fences, caused all sorts of damage, all sorts of difficulties, threatened the welfare of Lawrence Anthony and his staff. But he persevered over the course of many years. He developed a loyalty, a trust with this elephant herd, and really brought them around. So I think that's an incredible strength of character he showed. And the one final one would be Gerald Durrell. So more famous, but he was an environmental author. He effectively pioneered the modern zoo. So zoos being used as these hubs for conservation, breeding up endangered species, having that role as well. But incredible communicator. He is still my favorite author of all time. His book, My Family and Other Animals, is classic, definitely a must read. I've read it half a dozen times. It's really, really a fine read, very light-hearted, engaging, humorous, but insightful as well at the same time. So he's someone I definitely look up to in terms of what he did. I'm writing a book actually right now, so a second inspired by him, partially about my own experiences and partially about stories I've heard. I'd say taking more of an anecdotal tone in terms of connecting people with nature.
Yeah. I mean, I love the fact there. Just to want to close off, what's your take on zoos?
It depends on the zoo. Short answer. So zoos done right are great. I think they're incredible centres for environmentalism. They do a wonderful job caring for animals. I've volunteered, helped out in a number of them in my time. So I've seen sort of behind the scenes of what they do. My most recent placement was at the Wildlife Hospital at the local zoo. So it's called Taronga Zoo. And the work they do is incredibly detailed, really, really tough work they do, caring for both zoo animals and the wild animals that are brought into them. So fulfilling almost a rescue role as well in doing that rehab work. But I think zoos are invaluable to this conservation scheme. The challenge is when you have the animal husbandry done wrong. So when animals are abused, mistreated. But that's more common now in circuses, in the theme parks often, where we see some of this conflict arising, and in commercial industry as well. So in the hunting and the finning industries as well.
I was just back referencing there as well. So the Gerard Durrell, that was the BBC did a bit of a sort of sitcom documentary off the back of that, didn't they?
Yeah.
The Durrell family, and I mean Gerald is, I think Gerald was the young fellow, the sort of biologist. Is that?
Yeah, eccentric. Yes.
So, but his again love for animals, etc. So yeah. It was amazing just because it's just when you mentioned Durrell and then that sort of was springing to mind. So that's quite something. But it's great though that you're actually is taking the time to document that, and actually you obviously have a bit of a vision for capturing that as you go along. Where's that come from?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I've been incredibly blessed in my life so far. So I've been able to live this life, experiencing nature, being able to build these relationships with other animals. And for me, the work I do, storytelling, is connecting people with nature. It's all about giving others that opportunity. So starting Human Nature Projects, my charity, was a real eye-opener for me. It showed me what could happen, what I could do in terms of community building within the space, in terms of creating an entry point into the field. So I'd found it really challenging as a minor, as a young person, to find these experiences, these placements, these opportunities. It took a lot of grit, a lot of perseverance, and trying to streamline that process for others was a big consideration for me. So yeah, I mean, that past is a large part of what drives me, and in the present, it's this ongoing connection with animals. So the animal rehab work I do is the incredible leaders I work with. So I get to speak with people in a dozen countries a day, sometimes even with human nature projects, working with incredible leaders, and being able to see all the wonderful things that they're doing through the charity and otherwise is really, really inspiring for me, seeing this new generation, what we could do, what we are doing, and where things might just lead. I think that's what keeps me going.
Talk to us about school.
Yeah, so I'm in final year of high school. I finish actually mid-November, so I have all the final exams coming up, finished all the school assessments, just got those final hurdles to jump over. But I mean, I don't find school particularly challenging. I enjoy the academic life. They say change is as good as rest. So those 6 hours out of my day are sort of a break from the rest of work. I get to clear my mind, do other things, and then hop straight back into it. So I really enjoy the subjects I do. I do use some languages. So French has really helped me working with some of the African countries, particularly handy skill. I spent a month over in France actually. So sort of immersive language experience. But working in a wildlife rescue centre near Marseille. So sort of towards the French Alps region, in a quite remote country, which was great. So I do find it useful occasionally. I can't say I often do, certainly not maths, English, sciences, dare I say. Most of the subjects. I enjoy geography. Geography is great, but on the whole, I love having that other aspect of my day. So being able to learn, see some other interests. I'm generally a curious type, so I enjoy things a bit wacky, a bit weird. And learning through the academic side has been an enabler for me in that respect. So yeah, I mean, I won't be particularly sorry to miss that part of my life, to step on to the next part of my journey, but I have enjoyed it, the time I've spent there.
And through that process, I mean, how's the human interaction been for you?
I've been to quite a few schools, so I've mixed chop change friends, had all sorts of different experiences with the schooling. I'm generally quite high performing academically, so I fall out with the geeky bunch, whatever they may be in your equivalent. Yeah, I mean, I've had some really close friends, I still do, where I'm Manly selective right now, so sort of local school. Just down the road is great for me. It gives me plenty of chances to connect with other very intelligent people, but also to devote time to my other interests. So it's really, really encouraging of what I do, and really supports that entrepreneurial mindset. It's got lots of doers and shakers and makers in that school. So it's a community I've really enjoyed. Yeah, it will be something I miss, but who knows what's next.
What's next? What's your aspiration?
Come mid-November, when I'm done with final exams, I'll take the gap year. So that was always my intention prior to COVID. I think I'll still go ahead with it unless something major happens. I've recently heard that I've been offered a place on the Anant Climate Fellowship. So it's a 1-year course, like a diploma, in which I'll be working mostly remotely with an Indian university. So it's a cohort of 24 odd folks selected from 1,300 applicants across the globe. So an elite core team doing this programming on climate change, sustainability, and environmental design, how we can move forward as humans in tandem with nature. So that, I think, will be really interesting. It aligns certainly with many of my interests, and almost a uni workload. So that will take most of my evenings, but still freeing up the time for other pursuits. So I'm in pre-production for a short documentary series about animal rescuing here in Australia. Depending on COVID, depending on travel restrictions, we'll see how that goes. But certainly hoping to start or continue shooting when I'm done with those exams. Devote some more time to that. Definitely devote some more time to growing human nature projects. So being able to fill those 6 hours, 8 hours in a day, which I had set aside for school, with other things, will definitely free me up a bit. And I mentioned I'd love to move into wildlife filmmaking as a career. So any experiences I can gain there would be invaluable.
And do you have a vision of how you would like to communicate your message in terms of, well, I mean, your vision, your mission, your goal?
Yeah, well, I'm doing it in all sorts of ways right now, and I'd love to expand that, continue it, keep the bucket list, sort of long-term to-do list of where I'd like to be, where I'd like to go, some future plans. Right now, I'm doing podcasting, so just started that up, and that has been a whole new journey for me, a whole new learning curve. I mentioned the TEDx speech, so continuing doing gigs like that. Being able to share my thoughts with audiences, especially online at the moment. So I had been booked in for India earlier this year, a few months back, for the World Wilderness Congress, hoping to make it to the rescheduled one next year. Likewise, World Conservation Congress. I spoke at the World Biodiversity Forum a few months back in Davos. So picking up bits and pieces as I go. Trying to really refine, formulate my messaging in terms of, this human nature, how we can reconnect, this family tree of life, all these sorts of things. Give people that chance to immerse themselves in nature and really appreciate other animals. So podcasting, public speaking, 2 routes. Now the authorship is a recent one I've taken to. So 6 weeks of lockdown here in Australia. I spent alongside studies writing this first book of mine, which was a great experience. It certainly solidified some of my experiences and some of my knowledge in the space. Definitely helped to communicate its messages. So that's one I'm definitely looking to continue. But also in the shorter form content, so in the blog postings, in online articles, everything makes a difference, I think. So keeping all of that up and then moving into the wildlife filmmaking. So I've done bits and pieces on the side. I spent 6 weeks in South Africa this January, working with a group called Wild Earth TV, which I found really inspiring, incredible model they use. So I'd love to continue working with projects, initiatives like that, using that as a very powerful platform to connect people with nature.
Which, I mean, I listen, I love your passion. I love what you do. It does fly slightly against the, by your own example there, the born introvert. Blogging, podcasting, speaking, it's a bit, it's a bit of a polarity change there.
It's definitely been a big shift for me. It happened really when I started Human Nature Projects. So I mentioned those first few months, really pivotal for me, working very hard, but also stepping a long way outside of my comfort zone. So that showed me I could do it. And then it's been a matter of building up the skill sets and reaching out for these new opportunities, taking that leap and seeing where it led. So yeah, I'd still call myself an introvert. I still see in myself many of those characteristics, but I have learned to work outside of those bounds somewhat in communicating this messaging. It's been really interesting for me, seeing how that's come along. And it's a place that I certainly wouldn't have expected myself to be in at this stage, or 2 years ago, wherever you want to look back to. I think it's something which was quite a sudden shift for me, working into those spaces, but it's something which is definitely growing on me So we'll see where all of it goes.
Interesting. I mean, I'm trying to work out the math here. When you're 87, when I think in 87 or is it 97 when it'd be the year 2100 or whatever we call it then.
Yeah.
Do you have any concept of where you could be, want to be? Do you think out that far at all?
Yeah, when I'm nearing 197 odd years, where would I like the world to be? It's a really hard question because I think conservation itself is 60, 70 years old. It's changed radically in that time. If we try and project that even further, so double the span it's been going for, where will it be? Who knows? Where I'd like it to be is more aligned with this human nature worldview. So building in the chances for animals and people to interact more, having those closer relationships, and being able to thrive, coexist simultaneously. That's the ideal. In terms of the delivery, in terms of how that looks, it's way too soon to tell.
I was going to say a nice 80-year business plan, because I mean 80 years in terms of nature is nothing, right?
Yeah. Well, at the rate we're changing nature now is a big change, but in the rate we're changing ourselves, it's a long span. So where both of those situations will be, who knows? Nature is very resilient. So as you say, it works on these long-term scales. If we can try and take that into account, but also remedy some of the issues on the short term. It's trying to strike that balance. How much do we intervene? How much do we leave it to itself? There's no right answers, but we do our best.
What's on the bucket list for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'd love to travel some more once COVID closes down, once things return to normal, once the borders are back open, then I'd love to make it out, perhaps in my gap year, perhaps afterwards. We'll see how things are tracking by then. But I'd love to make it to Africa again, a really, really fascinating place for these conservation schemes. It's got much of the best, much of the worst in terms of what's going on. So that'd be a really interesting place to work. I mentioned I spent some time in South Africa. So that's had its own share of fascinating conservation stories. But I'd love to make Central Eastern Africa, spend some time over there, the likes of Uganda, some of the conflict countries. So in Congo, for example, really interesting how that's working out. Madagascar, it's definitely on the list as well, to make it over there. Again, lots of human-animal conflicts, so working out mitigation for that, how both can coexist. Really tough, but a worthy challenge as well. So yeah, Africa's definitely captured my heart. I love to make it over there as much as possible. I'd love also to see a bit more of Australia as well. So Sydney's this hub of Australia, this major world city, dominant in the nation. But Australia is a very, very diverse place. So even if we've got some of the borders shut internationally, then perhaps making it further around the country would be great. See and share some of the amazing wildlife we've got around here. So in that documentary series I'm making, but also in other pursuits, other ventures, as much as I can do to share this passion for nature would be great. And long term, it's moving into these wildlife film networks, so producing, presenting documentaries, and trying to reach a much larger audience. If you can count as a bucket list goal.
Absolutely. Well, that's what it's all about getting it out there and putting out your dreams and ambitions, and you never know who's listening. That's what it's all about. I'm curious. You use very strong language around Africa. It's like capturing your heart, where I'd love to be, etc. I mean, that sounds like it's something that's really caught your heart.
Definitely, yeah. So especially spent the time in Southern Africa over the past few years, but really interesting how things have worked out there. Say end of the apartheid era, still plenty of challenging issues in South Africa as a country, but doing some sterling conservation work. I mean, the southern white rhino is a brilliant example. It was down to about a dozen individuals, a tiny, tiny population, but they managed to build it back up. So controlled some of the poaching. They managed to put some heavy security protocols on these very few rhinos, but then releasing them out to other national parks, spreading them back across their original range across the country, which is practically unprecedented for such a large animal, such scales. It's really inspiring how that worked out. And if we can replicate that in other places, if we can learn from some of those experiences, but also deal with some of those ongoing issues in the country. So rhino poaching, elephant poaching has been going down, which is an incredible success story for them over there, but still going on. And so how can we try and mitigate that, find the solutions? How can we work with other stakeholders? So, I mean, some really problematic industries over there as well, in this kind of line hunting. If we can find a better or worse ways of looking at trophy hunting, the likes of that, is it good, is it bad? Who knows? It's a debate again. But very similar to Australia, Africa has the best side. It's got people doing incredible things. It's got communities who are really engaged in conservation. But it's also got a suite of issues it's having to overcome, ongoing challenges which it faces. So that's I think what makes it so fascinating for me, and of course very majestic megafauna which it has. But I think that's what initially drew me in, and what continues to fascinate me about the people, about the culture, about the country.
I'm really struck by how, you know, it comes across very much as the interaction between sort of man and nature, man and animal, man and man, animal and animal. You know, it's not so much there. It's the crossover points, right?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, I think traditionally in conservation we've been trying to boost species. So, say if you're the WWF in India trying to boost tiger populations, then success will be if you double the number of tigers in a national park, and then that would be, we've done a sterling job here, and that's all great. That's conservation done well. But I think the better, more sustainable way to do it is if we can get people involved. So bringing people, communities back into these equations. I think that's how we need to do things, how we need to reframe these conservation dialogues. Otherwise, you're doing this short-term band-aid solution. It's never going to last because people are the problem. We need to solve the problem. We don't need to solve the symptoms, the effects of that problem. So, yeah, I think it's really important that we have people and nature talking, having some of that interaction put back in context.
I'm going to ask probably a fairly obvious question, but what animal do you see yourself as, or what would you be the equivalent of in the animal world?
Yeah. So I've asked a very similar question of many of my guests on my podcast, Human Nature Cast, and had some really interesting answers. But in terms of what animal I see myself as, the answer I'd be going for right now would be an elephant. The time I spent in South Africa recently doing some of the filming work, lots of elephants. I got to spend some really quality time with them, up close, seeing their interactions. And obviously, I mentioned Lawrence Anthony earlier. I've been doing lots of reading, lots of research into the creatures. They're just incredible animals. Very intelligent, very complex socially. So I think there's plenty more to discover about them. We're only just decoding their language. These deep infrasound rumbles they use to communicate. It's mind-blowing how they live out their lives, how they are operating as individuals and as societies in these communities. I think it's a very close human analogy. So, I mean, we could go for a more extreme example in the animal kingdom. I could say I'm a stick insect, but the way of things is that people don't see themselves as stick insects, and they're too obscure. So elephants are very, very human. If you get to spend time up close with them, see how they move, how they interact, it's really transformational for me. And I've been very privileged in that respect.
Hey, listen, if you want to be a stick insect, that's fine by me.
Yeah, well, that's the alternative. I've kept stick insects many times over the years, so they're great animals too.
I can't quite do the crossover in terms of what similar characteristics they have, but hey, listen, you know where you're going with this. So I'm going to ask another obvious question. I mean, you are 17, a statement of fact, but that does not come across, and you're incredibly coherent and things like that. Does this cause you opportunities or inconvenience, or what's your take on it?
It's a double-edged sword. So I really enjoy working in the youth space, really energizing, vitalizing, working with that demographic. Certainly very hopeful, seeing what the future will hold. In terms of being a enhancer, inhibitor to opportunities, it's hard to say. Some are enabled by my being so young, by my sort of being this voice of the youth, this sometimes represented as a marginalized demographic, not so much heard as a voice in these spaces. But yes, it does prevent many things. It's much harder to travel, say, independently. It's much harder to run a large charity. So there are barriers it poses on things. And I can't count the number of times I've read an application which says you must be 18. It certainly poses some barriers to the work I do in all sorts of respects. Yeah, I look forward to a month's time being 18 as some easier paths to take for sure. But I think it's great starting this young. I'd certainly encourage it in others. And as long as you have that support network, that community, I think most of these challenges can be overcome.
No, listen, I get it, and I honestly I tip my hat to you. I think the clarity and ability to communicate, I think, is phenomenal, and I honestly I find it very inspiring. So it's and the word you've used there, and I think is fantastic. Is hopeful, because typically, I mean, as you say, the sort of the tabloid and news and the media version is despair is more probably common to what it is. But you use the word hopeful. Can you sort of talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So it ties back to some of this conservation optimism I mentioned earlier, trying to take the flip side of a lot of the messaging. The media may say that the Amazon has been burnt down in bushfires, but when you look at it, it's about 20% which was affected. It's a relatively small portion. It's still a major loss, but it's not catastrophic. The ecosystem will recover eventually. And things like that, appreciating the resilience of nature and appreciating the incredible success stories we've had. So I mentioned the southern white rhino. That's a fabulous example. Here in Australia, you've obviously had, I think it's the most mammal extinctions in the past few centuries. So a really challenging conservation work we do, and it's still got the third most threatened species of any country. So those are the negatives, but then you look at the positives, and those are that we've got an incredible wildlife rescue scheme. So all throughout the bushfires, which received a large amount of media coverage, there were incredible heroes saving, caring for all of those animals which were threatened by those processes. So greatly reducing the losses, especially in the larger critters, in the kangaroos, the koalas, wombats, wallabies. All of these have many of their lives to thank to these carers, and some really innovative work being done as well. So take the Great Barrier Reef and some of the really interesting work they're doing to try and preserve that ecosystem, because obviously greatly under threat. This statistic would be about 90% gone by 2050 under the current rate of change. So then you've got your negative framing, and the positive framing is we've got these new methods to try and change that stat, that we can, we still have a reef continuing in some appreciable scale for a long period of time. So breeding up these super corals, which are resistant to climate change and ocean acidification, all of these effects. Trying to collect coral spawn. So they've got underwater drones they use to pick up all the spores, the eggs, trying to crossbreed them, develop new strains, new varieties, which can repopulate the reef for bleached areas. All sorts of things. They're developing new structures in which reefs can grow. So all sorts of designs around that. They've tried cloud brightening, so chucking tiny microparticles of salt up into the clouds to reduce some of the insulation hitting the reef in that area. So crazy measures, but yeah, who knows what will work, and they're trying at all. They're throwing every last measure at it. So if you look at the people behind it, the stories they have, the measures being taken, then that really is a cause for hope, for me certainly.
I'm curious. I mean, we talked about sort of heroes and inspirational things, but that's on the human side. Is there any particular animal or something in nature that you are inspired by, or sort of see as a bit of a hero?
Oh, yeah, it's a really good question. And I think for me, it would be going back to these animal rescues. Some of the incredible cases I've seen where animals were on the brink of death, but then managed to fight, this incredible resilience as they struggled to regain their health over often many months at a time, being able to slowly recuperate. And I see that as this microcosm, this metaphor for the nature, this world as a whole. What we can do if we work with nature, if we help it to regenerate, to recover. It's been, yeah, you definitely get the ups and downs. So I've held many animals as they held their last breaths as they died in my hands, and that's traumatic, it's emotional. But you get through it on the back of some of these inspiring stories. So we do release many of our animals, they're able to recover, they get back in the wild. So I mentioned Ned Brush Turkey, just released it, seeing it wander off happily into the wild, having overcome this eye infection, having overcome this debilitating injury, then that is really powerful for me as well. I think the turning point came in France. It was, I mentioned earlier, I spent 4 weeks over there helping to care for injured wildlife. It was mostly birds of prey, so raptors and hedgehogs as well. But there was a day where we actually drove out to the French Alps. We did a vulture release. So there was a griffon vulture that had been in care for a long period of time. It was overcoming lead poisoning. So a very frequent issue you get with the carrion feeders over there from some of the hunting practices they have. But this was in back to full health. So yeah, we carried it over there. I used the dog cage to transport a bird like that, dog travel kennel, and opened its door on this steep precipice, and it just flew out. And I stayed there for the next half hour watching it circling amongst must have been dozens of other vultures on that steep cliff edge, that precipice, in the setting afternoon light. Seeing that scene was absolutely magical. It's something I can shut my eyes and see to this day. We released it on this conservation area they're doing. So they study intensively the vultures. They leave out sheep carcasses from local farmers to count their numbers, to ensure their breeding success. So hence the large gathering of vultures in one place. But seeing them there, seeing that recovery, because griffon vultures had declined, had plummeting populations in that region of late. So another conservation success story. But yeah, just that moment was when I thought to myself, what if everyone could experience this? What then? Because that changed my life. That changed the way I saw animals, the way I saw nature, the way I saw the world. So if others can experience that, then what then was the question for me.
No, absolutely. It's, as you say, I mean, it's a moment of experience. A couple of things. I mean, is there any particular, I mean, that in itself sounds like a very proud moment, but is there any particularly proud moment that stand out for you and has had a really significant impact?
Yeah, that moment was really impactful for me. The other moment which comes to mind, which probably shaped who I am today, was actually when I was much younger. So I was about 10 years old at the time. And at the time I was camping with my family It was in a very remote region of northern Botswana. It was an unfenced campsite, so the animals could just wander through, walk through the campsite, fire circles everywhere. And I was walking back, trailing behind my family from, it was campground toilet block, as it happens. So just taking my time, dawdling, appreciating the nightlife, scenery, the stars. But as we reached the edge of that fire circle for our campground, so stepping into the light, I had this sort of sixth sense, and I looked behind me and I saw it was a young leopard crouched, stalking low to the ground. It must have been 2 meters behind me, if that, but really, really close. So it had been clearly trailing me, stalking me throughout that walk, or for much of it. And yeah, for whatever reason, I sensed its presence behind me. I said something very understated, like, "I think there's something behind me." My brother turned around with a flashlight, with a torch, so caught it fully in the beam. But I stared into its eyes for 2 or 3 full seconds. And that was another moment where time stood still, where you have this inexplicable sensation of being connected to nature. It's wordless, it's indescribable, but really powerful, all the more so for it in terms of what you feel then. Leopards being ambush predators, story ends with the leopard walking off. So it wouldn't have attacked me even when I turned around. Famously, what they do with tigers in India, putting a face mask on the back of their head, so it looks like you're watching it from all directions. So I was perfectly safe, thankfully, by the end of finding it, of seeing that leopard. But yeah, I know for a fact that incident was reported. It made it to the local authorities, and I can only imagine would have led to that leopard being most likely killed, possibly relocated, due to no fault of the leopard's own. So I would assume it had been fed by campers previously, it had grown certainly habituated to humans. It's not natural behaviour for a leopard to stalk a human, even if it's a young child like myself. It was quite pivotal for me at the moment, but even more so looking back in terms of what that meant for myself and for the animal in question, because it's just that strange relationship we humans have with nature, this fear often in many cases of nature, of the unknown, of everything the wild represents. That's something which also sticks in my mind, another one which comes flashing back to me on certain occasions. So between those two, those were quite interesting tipping points in my life, which certainly changed the way I look at things around me and the way I look at the world.
And interestingly, you talked about getting a sense. I mean, do you, in terms of those sensory faculties, I mean, is that something you take on, you understand in yourself?
Yeah, in terms of being able to understand, communicate with other animals, I've never quite subscribed to like pure animal psychic. I can speak telekinetically with this chimpanzee, but I do believe there's a wealth of non-verbal communication which we as humans and other animals and between species engage in. So famously, if you're a researcher trying to analyze the interactions of chimpanzees, you're not looking often at their verbal communication, their screams, their hoots. You're looking at how their body language is presented, how they gesture, all of these things, their facial expressions. That's much, much more meaningful for ourselves as humans in interpreting their behavior, but also for the chimpanzees themselves. We're very steeped in our ways as humans, that we have to communicate with language, with words, and it's a barrier in terms of not letting our other senses do the work. One of my favourite animals to have in care is a frogmouth. They're wonderful creatures. Basically, they spend their whole day sitting still. They're so designed as to be camouflaged perfectly, immaculately, as a tree branch. So they sit still, they have this sort of erect posture, and they angle themselves to look like this stump, this branch, knotting out from a tree. So they basically don't move at all, or very little, but they're still incredibly charismatic in terms of if you get to know them. So being able to interact with them, often giving them quote unquote flying lessons. Being able to strengthen their wing muscles, especially if they've been in captivity for a long time. You're sort of flight testing them, being able to see them at their best, as well as completely immobile. You really realize that you have to give nature the time and space to fully understand and appreciate it. So that, I think, is where this sensory appreciation comes in. You have to be able to look at nature how nature might look at itself, if you want to subscribe to that viewpoint. If we can try and look beyond a very limited human frame of reference. You have the concept of the Umwelt. So I think it's really powerful looking at this Umwelt, which is how we live within a bubble of our perception of reality. We're confined to a very narrow set of viewpoints, which shapes how we interpret everything which goes on around us. So that's very, very different if you're a frogmouth, or if you're a chimpanzee, or if you're a lorikeet. So you can try and understand how they perceive the world increasingly with new research, new things coming to light. So it's a realm of pursuit in which we're getting much closer to nature, but there still will be some pretty significant barriers in terms of what we can and can't understand in terms of communicating with other animals, appreciating them at their own level. All you can do is try. So that's what I'm trying to do in the animal rescue work I do, and the environmental communication, storytelling. All of this is framing a messaging in such a way that you look at nature for nature's sake, in terms of how beautiful it is, how incredible it is, how amazing, intelligent these creatures may be, as opposed to it's worth half the world's economy, which it is, but that's not the point. Nature's more than that.
I'm curious on the sort of almost the emotional side of things. I mean, you know, tigers don't tend to harbor bad feelings, do they? Or do you know? I mean, almost are they animals actually evolving much better than humans are in general?
Oh, are animals evolving much better than humans are? That's something I've never heard before, but I like it as a thought. Yeah, I mean, humans have gone backwards in some senses. We definitely have that disconnect to our prior selves, to some of our stronger instincts. Some of that genetic code has weakened with some of the comforts of modern living, couchy society we're now living in. So we definitely need to learn from other animals about how to be better people, about how to embrace our more instinctual, habitual characteristics instead of those learned societal ones. So not focusing so much on the intelligence, this concrete learned knowledge, but more on the problem solving, interpretation, learning new viewpoints, new perspectives. And with this globalized world we live in, we're increasingly trying to overcome these barriers, be they language, culture, all these difficulties in communication. So if you extrapolate that to nature, everything you can learn from trying to talk with a parrot, then if you do that, you can speak with anyone across the globe. So it's all about trying to share this universal language. It's all about trying to create those opportunities for humans to learn from nature. But yeah, who knows what a parrot's thinking? Who knows what a chimpanzee's thinking? We can but extrapolate. Hence, you have the claims of anthropomorphism, that we're attributing these human qualities to animals. But what other frame of reference do we have to draw upon? I think it's pointless making that argument, because we are humans, so we have only this limited set of features which we categorize the world into. So why can't a parrot be in love? Why can't a parrot feel sentimentality? Why can't a parrot ponder at its own existence? We wouldn't know in any case. So I think it's better to assume more rather than less in this case, and try and view nature at its best, take it as brilliant until proven otherwise, is my viewpoint.
No, I mean, it's a very interesting view. I mean, maybe the frog mouth is just actually processing until it's eventually going to come out with full sentences, and it's taking an observer and listening role to begin with until it decides what it wants to say.
Yeah, well, if you look at them, they very much have that philosophical air. Great philosophers, the frog mouths. I think that's why we came up with the classical composer naming scheme. They definitely have that slightly antique air around them, but they definitely have that air of intelligence as well. Who knows what's going on in their mind? They certainly operate on a different scale. The analogy that comes to mind is David Attenborough once said, I think it was in his Private Life of Plants, that these plants, these creatures do have really interesting interactions, relationships, lives, but we don't appreciate them because they're happening on a different timescale, happening very differently to how we know and love our lives as humans. So it's really difficult to come to appreciate nature on its own terms. But if we can learn to do that, then that will revolutionize what it means to be human.
No, it's always interesting, and obviously the emotions of a human, and all the guilt, the shame, the pleasure, the desire, the hopes, the wishes, the fears, the anxieties. You know, I was going to say you don't often see an anxious chimp, but that's actually maybe not the case. I don't know.
You certainly get anxious chimps. It's whether we can recognize that, or certainly the average Joe can. But with chimps, they're very similar to humans, so I'm sure you could interpret when a chimp's anxious, when it's being bullied, when it's feeling jealous. The challenge is with the other animals, which ones are higher order animals, which ones are stick insects, which you can't empathize with, which you struggle to communicate with. So it's all a scale, it's all a messy, interconnected, naturey stuff, which we're trying to untangle as the decades progress. But we're slowly making sense of it, so who knows what's next.
A mosquito's trying to bite you. What do you do?
Oh, I try and tackle this question in my book, actually. I felt I had to answer it because I often get asked it, and it's a difficult question to answer. So I think first you have to put it into perspective. A mosquito trying to bite you is a female mosquito, probably pregnant with eggs. So that biting you is her enabling her to raise her next generation, to give birth, and ultimately create a new life. So do you want to swat a pregnant woman? If you do this human analogy again, yeah, maybe not. But yeah, humans will naturally not be particularly keen on being bitten by mosquitoes. I think the middle ground is in a preventative measure. So if you want to wear an insect repellent, then you're not especially hindering mosquitoes, depending on what insect repellent it is. It has to be a sensible one instead of an incredibly toxic one, such as have been used in the past. But if you can prevent the need to swat at mosquitoes and try and, yeah, it's all about living alongside nature as opposed to swatting it, as opposed to degrading it. Then it's finding that equilibrium with a mosquito or with any other living creature.
So it's more you lean on the sort of symbiotic sort of let's live together if we can type scenario.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the idea. And I came across, when I was writing my book, there's some research as well into jumping spiders. So one of my favorite all-time insects. Definitely look up a picture if you haven't heard of them, but they're beautiful, incredible creatures. And there's several varieties of jumping spiders which are famous for preying on mosquitoes. And one of these is attracted to dirty underwear if you leave it out. So my tip for you is, if you don't want to be bitten by mosquitoes, you have to leave out dirty underwear, attract the jumping spiders, and those will eat mosquitoes for you. It's a very simple solution.
I will tell my kids, they'll be delighted. I have actually just Googled a picture of the jumping spider in there. Quite a beautiful creature, actually.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. They're some of the more enigmatic of the insects. I had many a happy hour photographing them in my garden, and you find them all across the world. So I've had them walk up to me in school recesses. And I was minding my own business. I love insects for that. They're completely ubiquitous. So look out for jumping spiders because you'll find them.
You mentioned somebody there, David Attenborough. Talk to him. Talk to me about
Hmm.
your thoughts on David.
I think it's incredible what he's done. He started with effectively no such thing as environmentalism, or certainly a very gentrified concept for very elitist, white class naturalists, collecting specimens, shooting them, taking them back for their cabinets to display. And we've now arrived with his work and many others where we are now. So environmentalism is accepted as being for the greater good. It's got many, many people working towards it. It's a large portion of the world population self-identifies as nature enthusiasts, all sorts of pursuits, and bird watching is, I think, one of the fastest growing hobbies, certainly in the US and many other places as well. So in terms of popularizing nature, natural history, he's done an absolutely spiffing job, to use a British language, if you can. I think it's incredible what he's done in terms of bringing it to a wider audience. And I mean, there'll always be complaints if you want to go down that path. People may not like that they've cut a scene together for a chase from different takes, but it's all about storytelling. So it's all about what you're framing as your message, and how that's teaching people about nature, about natural processes, better equipping them to appreciate nature in their everyday lives. And wildlife filmmaking itself has given a tremendous amount back to conservation. It's allowed that movement to thrive. It's allowed people to recognize it, appreciate it for the work we're doing. So in terms of that, you use the word symbiotic relationship. So a symbiotic relationship between wildlife filmmaking and conservation. There's very, very strong ties that we've got going on there. And Attenborough was the trailblazer in that respect. So if I can emulate some of that, if I can continue that trend, that'd be incredible.
No, I mean, it's interesting because I don't know. I'm sure from a purist point of view, I'm sure somebody would take umbrage at something, but I mean, from a lay person's point of view, I think it's a phenomenal job to do, bridging a gap between the two, and you know, but again, that's not as an expert or as a specialist, you know. And in regards to expert and specialist, would you categorize yourself as that in any sort of sector or area?
Oh, I don't think so. No, I'm doing a fake it till you make it perspective. I certainly have learned many skills in the past 12 months, starting up human nature projects, getting heavily involved in all these pursuits. So for me, it's been only a learning journey, a learning curve, which I've undertaken. I certainly don't consider myself expert in anything in particular. I'm happy to pass on knowledge, and I continue to mentor a few folks as well as receiving mentorship myself. It's all this circle, this continuing trail of relationships which you're building in this conservation space, which is itself quite insular. So whatever I can do to support others, and whatever I can find support myself, that's how I get by. But in 50 years' time, ask me that question again, I might just find I've got some more experiences under my belt.
Well, it depends whether you subscribe to the 10,000 hour rule. You know, if you do 10,000 hours, it certainly puts you in the professional category, whether it's expert or the ultimate source. I don't know, but it's an interesting. In terms of superpower, what would you say is a superpower for you?
What's a superpower? I mean, I mentioned earlier that I enjoy, I guess, working under stress. And so that's something I found really helpful, actually, and that I have this contradictory, paradoxical reaction to stressful situations, to really nitty gritty challenges, which I love to work through, get stuck into. So it's it might be a form of perseverance, it might be a form of resilience, but for me, I just enjoy working through some of those immense challenges. Environmentalism is full of these issues, these complex challenges we're working with. So I think that's been valuable for me over the past 12 months as my journey's progressed throughout this learning curve. Having that in my toolkit under my belt probably has been the thing which has helped me most.
That's interesting. I mean, the stress of a situation. I mean, and you talked about, I think it was the octopus earlier on, is able to almost instantly adapt to its environment, under a stress situation. Because nature does some pretty phenomenal things under stress too, right?
Certainly, yeah. Some brilliant examples there. Octopuses, you mentioned some of the most intelligent creatures out there, but without a backbone, without any human analogy you could draw. So very unlike us, but super intelligent beings even so. The analogy I like to draw is with slime mold. So slime mold is a tiny single-celled organism, effectively. It's microscopic, wouldn't see it with naked eye, essentially. But it's what you might expect that sort of appearance if you left a loaf of bread out for a month in hot sun. So it's a mold. It looks pretty disgusting by most viewpoints, but these tiny single-celled organisms actually group together in communities. So they go through a very interesting life cycle whereby they gather together at certain intervals. They coalesce to form what have been described as slug-like creatures, beings. So they form these larger collectives, and they then operate as part of this a group, almost like a multicellular organism, so like your eye, being able to operate limbs, appendages, move as one, which is incredible because they don't have a brain. So how do they organize this? How do they do it? It blows the mind. But then even more than that, they go through a second stage in which they're then forming, it's like a dandelion, if you want to imagine it like that. So there's all the ones at the bottom, which form this stem, and they've got a ball, a clump on the top, which end up being as if a spore. So they are then released onto the wind. They're blown all across the surrounding countryside, and they start new slime mold colonies, which enables it to live, adapt, thrive, continue the next generation. So all of this it does without a brain. It's able to adapt, to continue to survive in spite of some what would consider to be major disadvantages in that you can't think and you can't operate with any conscious intention, but it still does this. And even more startlingly, there's been some quite popular recent scientific research which has come out to show that slime mold is able to map complex situations. So it's been known for some time it can solve mazes. It maps out all the possible routes and then it picks the fastest one. So it picks a successful solution to the maze. But now scientists have been setting them challenges. So they have a block of agar gel, like a spot in which the slime mold can grow, a food source for it to cultivate on. And then they add like these pit stops, these patches of food to model the population dynamics of a particular area. So I think they've done this with London's major highways and with, I think, Tokyo's railway system. In both cases, incredibly successful. The slime mold has mapped out to extreme detail all of these routes which human engineers have come up with. So creating a perfect model of the solutions humans have devised over many, many years, over many planning consultations. It's arrived simultaneously at the same solution and in many cases improved upon it. So found even more efficient routes, even more efficient networks to build. So, I mean, look at that and tell me that we can't learn from nature. It just shows that nature is so resilient, so adaptable. So if I can take after slime mold, then I'll definitely learn what I can. As opposed to being an elephant, less glamorous, but certainly lots to learn.
I love that. I mean, you can't exactly put it on a leash, but yeah, it would make a great pet. You know, it's
Yeah.
you can map out transport networks, and I don't know why the Ghostbusters and what do you call it, the Slimer,
Hmm.
and that
Yeah.
sort of sprung to mind. You know, it's but it is amazing. You know, I mean, and all this stuff is happening in something that's you need a microscope to see it, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. When it gets together, you can just about see it. It's on the edge of vision, but tiny, tiny scales. And we know practically nothing about creatures operating on these scales. So it's the
Mm.
99.999999999% of life we ever mapped. So who knows what's out there? And who knows what discoveries remain waiting to be seen?
Oh, no, definitely, it's absolutely fascinating. Um, I'm curious then in terms of yourself and what would be on your sort of most wanted list in terms of animals to meet or spend more time with. Then where would be top of the tree for you?
Oh, yeah, most wanted list. It's a good one. I'd love to spend more time, I think, on on coastal environments. So I'm very much a land lubber. I'd love to work maybe in a coral reef environment, work with some of the aquatic marine species, and that's a whole different ball game. So if I can gain some experience there, that'd be great. It's very different to some of the work I've been doing, but incredibly impressive, even so. And where I'm in Sydney, that's where the tremendous diversity of life is. It's where we still have these great snorkeling spots, great diving spots just off the coastline. So that's the world I'd love to learn more about, appreciate. I've been brushing up on my fish ID. So whatever I can pick up along the way, that's all great. And my charity is just gained a special accreditation to the UN Oceans Conference. So maybe I'll be over there, Lisbon, June next year. Hopefully gain more in those circles. So that's on the list. Apart from that, I'd love to work definitely with the primates. So here in Australia, sadly lacking. We've got some incredible wildlife, even so. But I'd love to work more closely with the great apes, so the gorillas, the chimpanzees, the orangutans, up close in person. That'd be great. And I mentioned Madagascar earlier. So the lemurs there is a fascinating conservation case. Almost all of them endangered or heavily threatened. So challenging for sure, but very, very enigmatic, charismatic creatures to work with. So I do some more primate work as well, and chameleons. I mean, it's great. It's a long list.
I was going to say you've got a fair amount of work ahead of you. I love it. In terms of if you were able to go back in time to a certain period, evolution, stage in our history, is there any particular one you would go to?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed some of those early stages, I guess, before I got more formally involved in wildlife circles, doing lots of the volunteering work I do. So before I had all those draws on my time, just going back to the purest sense of nature appreciation, doing the bird watching, doing the wildlife photography, which sadly I don't have a lot of time for anymore. So that's something I'd love to go back to relive. The time I spent in France was great. So often these times I spend abroad are most memorable. And I mentioned 6 weeks in South Africa this January, so before COVID hit, before the lockdown, all the travel restrictions. That was some of the happiest times of my life. I spent over there and working with that team. I think it's amazing what they do and some of the experiences I had. So yeah, any of all of those. But I love my daily life over here, caring for the animals. Still, I'm able to cultivate those relationships, and I enjoy the work I do. I'm driven by passion as well as vision, as well as goals. So yeah, there are times I've enjoyed, times I certainly relive, but I'm happy to continue the journey on the whole, and who knows?
On a whole, do you think people get you?
It's different what I speak about, what I'm advocating for. So it's not easy for people to take at face value. I mean, when I was crafting my TEDx speech, I gave a demo to a few folks, and this was precisely the feedback I received. So, how are people going to understand it? It's so different, so weird what you're suggesting. How can humans be animals? How can animals be human? It's two different worlds we come to accept. So it can be hard. It depends on who you're talking to. So to give you the wildlife care analogy, where I'm here in Sydney, I get to often interact with some of the most incredibly sincere, beautiful members of the public who are calling in animals in all states of distress. Some are completely fine, but they just look worried or whatever's going on, and some are just been concussed by a car. But the people who call them in are absolutely incredible. So I get some really heartfelt thanks, some really heartfelt meaning out of the work I do there. So that's something I've enjoyed, certainly. But as for the wider picture, yeah, I think people understand that nature is in trouble, that especially in the climate change dialogue, which is much more publicised, much greater following, people understand there's a need for urgent change there. The challenge is in translating it where there's no direct human benefit. So I mentioned doing this conservation or conservation's sake, for the sake of protecting nature, because it's right. Getting those messages across are much, much, much harder. That's where the challenge is in the work I do and the worldview I'm advocating for. It's how to convince people to give up comforts in the way they perceive it, although not necessarily so. It's how to convince people to appreciate that they may not be perfect. They may be animals with all the imperfections that sadly carries with it in that term. And yeah, it's a major change. So it's going to be a gradual process, changing perspectives. But I've had some really, really positive feedback in the work I've been doing thus far. So continue that, spread it, and with 50 years in conservation, we should be in some good places.
No, I love it. I love the the actual passion you follow it with. I mean, emotionally, do you connecting to the animals and but also then seeing the brutality of what humans can do and don't do and things like that. Does that how does that affect your mindset in general?
Yeah. Well, I've been fortunate in some ways to not have witnessed the extreme worst of those cases. So I was speaking on my podcast the other day with someone, a journalist actually, who'd been to the wet markets in China. So very relevant with COVID, all of that dialogue which has come up. But some of the atrocious conditions of the animals kept in there. I've been fortunate to be working on the flip side of that, so with really good conservation organisations, with the zoos, with the wildlife sanctuaries, all the work they do. I've been insulated somewhat from the worst cases. Certainly you're aware of what is going on. Some of the very sad stories, seeing even in the wildlife rehab, seeing some of the animals, they don't make it through. And some of the human impacts which cause those fatalities. So I had a turtle come through a few months ago actually, but still a very memorable wildlife rescue we did. So sea turtle, green turtle we had, and I still remember I sat with it for about half an hour just watching the sunset. So it was very, very mellow, very enlightening on that spiritual level for me to be able to build that connection. But just whilst we were preparing it in enclosure, getting that all set up, having the water to house it with, and getting what was quite complex, as you can imagine, housing arrangement underway. But sadly, we heard that sea turtle didn't make it through. We passed it on to an experienced wildlife vet for emergency care. It had some pretty major damages. It had a cracked shell, some very heavy internal bleeding. So it didn't make it through. And that was very sad news for me to hear. So we do see the bad as well as the good in this wildlife care, which has that polarized viewpoint, but in all the work I do. So when I was in South Africa hearing gunshots at night, things like that, you're you don't see it, but you're aware that it's going on. You have to think, you have to wonder when you're woken up by those sounds. What is it? And being passed by these anti-poaching patrols, burly-looking men in khaki green suits and jeeps with AK-47s, and it's extreme what has to go on for conservation to take place. So having not spent much time on the front lines, I'm aware of the worst as well as the best of it, but I think there's both sides of the story.
Yeah, and I suppose it's the clarity of vision is going to help you sort of pull through that as well, because
Definitely.
to err is to be human, you know, and all the different sides of it, you know. No, it's totally fascinating. Tell me this: what's a guilty pleasure for you?
What's guilty pleasure? I mean, I really enjoy getting out back into nature when I can or can't find the time. So, I mean, I was snorkeling yesterday around a local beach called Shelley Beach, which was great, testing out a new underwater camera housing. So, this wildlife photography is my passion, my hobby, which I spend some of my spare time doing. And that was great. It was still a busy day. I probably shouldn't have taken that time out, but I think I needed it. It had been a long weekend, so that was great for me, and it was a wonderful snorkel. So I saw a dozen Port Jackson sharks in that bay area, which was good. Some wonderful fish life, which I'm learning about, as mentioned. So hence that link with this new fish ID guide I've got in my NH library downstairs. I collect some of those books, some of the literature. So still learning, but getting out in nature is a guilty pleasure for me.
I love it. And interesting, you know, you talked about learning. I mean, what is your learning style?
Experiential, very much so. So I need to see the fish and then match it to the field guide drawing. That's how I think you have to learn about nature. It's so infinitely complex that you can't know everything. There's no theory which can teach you how to ID a fish, which can teach you how to understand nature, these natural flows, these processes. You have to be in amongst it and have that experience, have that intuition much more than anything else. So I enjoy geography. I do well on that subject because I work, live, breathe that space. It's how I see the world, and that's what I enjoy. It's the same for anyone else doing schooling, same for anyone else with passion, a hobby, and pursuit. We have to immerse ourselves in that space to really appreciate it, and especially with nature having that infinite complexity of life, then you can specialize. I can be a specialist in the diptera and the flies. I can be a specialist in the reproduction of sharks, but that's not a path I'd like to go down. I'm not a scientific mind particularly, so I enjoy the nature appreciation in its purest sense, and that's about looking at animals, seeing what they are, knowing a bit about them, and just learning their life story, because it's interesting. It's like learning about people. It's like working with people in the service industries that so many people go into. Then, for me, the kick is in learning about the animals. So having that passion means I really enjoy getting out there and doing it that way.
Oh, I love it. I mean, it's so much. What's your takeaway for people? What's sort of a message you'd like to get across to people?
I think my major takeaway would be to try and see, understand, appreciate nature in your daily lives, however you can work that into your routine. So, I mean, I've spent bus trips doing learning a new bird species bus trip, learning how it lives, what it feeds on, what it looks like, what its call sounds like. These are simple things you can do daily commute as time you've got spare. Instead of checking social media, then you can do nature themed crossword. You can learn about local bird species. You can learn about insects in the garden. You can learn about how to start a greenhouse, start a farm, grow your own food. You can learn about how to start a bee hotel. All of these are ways in which you can give back to nature and understand it. It's more about setting the time aside, making it a daily schedule, making it a routine out of it. That's how you learn anything. So that's how you connect with nature, and that's how you appreciate it. And if you're ever struggling, if you're ever in need, then the communities are out there. That's what Human Nature Projects does. That's what I've been working with all sorts of organisations towards. So that's how I made it in the space, and that's how I certainly hope to help many others to do so.
Tell us exactly. I mean, how can people reach out to you? How can they follow? How can they help you and really sort of push forward?
Sure. So my website is elliotconnor.com. Really simple. ELLIOTCONNOR.com. My charity's website is humannatureprojects.org. Very simple. And my podcast is just called Human Nature. So you can search that up on your favorite podcast provider. It's a new show. So join us there and we'll join you for the journey.
Awesome. So tell us, I mean, in one or two words, what's your fire in the belly?
Sorry?
In one or two words, what is your fire in the belly?
Oh, I think my fire in the belly is nature and people and everything in between. That's
Love
where
it.
the beautiful complexity lies.
Love it. Elliot, it's been awesome to talk to you. I thank you so much for sharing and being so candid and not. Time flies when you're having fun, and I genuinely wish you all the best. And listen, you're only just getting started. That's what it's all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, all the listeners.